Thanks, Margaret. It is fun to be back in Montana. I can't say that it's my second home because I think I just have multiple homes. Now, while I did go east, I came back and I continue to go west, and I live out in the wet, timbered region. So, in part, this is a great break, although we've been dry this year, to be in the high mountain air of the Great Plains, quite a bit different from the soggy timber area that I live in. And I think I'll just mention that so that you'll know where my feelings are, because this presentation I'm going to make has a lot to do with that kind of thing, feelings and place. I live in Corbett, Oregon, which is, some of you may know, on the rim of the Columbia River Gorge, not far from Vista House, if you know where that is, just about 3 or 4 miles above Multnomah Falls in the woods, away from pavement. And it's a place that is full of its own kind of almost inherent drama, just like Montana is. And it brings to mind for me what I want to talk about, which is the differences of place, how one individual place is at one linked with other places and yet quite different. And the Lewis and Clark expedition, as we've heard already, is one of those great epics that allows us to do that. On August 12th, 1805, in present-day Idaho, Meriwether Lewis bent down to take a drink from a small stream that flowed west from a ridge. Quote from the journals, "I have tasted the waters of the Columbia." And almost with a sense of triumph, he jotted that down. Lewis had already looked west from the Idaho promontory to see nothing but a maze of mountains, ridges, peaks, some with a hint of snow. As he looked west, he wondered what route might be found through the mountains. And Clark scouted the Salmon River cleavage only to find it impassable. The expedition began its final leg of the outward journey through the Columbia River Basin to the Pacific. Lewis's feeling of accomplishment slid into a conundrum unlike any he had faced thus far on the trek. The season was late. It was now clear that the distance between the sources of the Missouri and the Pacific coast was not the, in quotes, plain they had expected. The two leaders talked about their options, quizzed Shoshones, and decided to make a choice of one of the many trails that would take them west, went north down the Bitterroot, and began the trek over the Lolo Trail. A passage that they had been warned was game poor. The men knew they had passed from one stage of their journey to another, and without assigning specific importance to the spot or the episode, they both knew that the country ahead of them was going to be different. Still, they had been misled before by Indian information, and some of the information they had was in conflict. But they were able to get an Indian guide to guide them through this maze of mountains, and that may have been a saving decision. Nonetheless, the captains had accomplished something in the passage from Missouri to Columbia environments. As John Allen, the geographer, has noted, this was a sense of accomplishment that was not unalloyed. That is, they knew that they had learned something, but it wasn't what they wanted to learn. Their enthusiasm was dampened by the realization that the short, easy link between the Missouri and the Columbia rivers was really a figment of imagination. That conclusion answered one of the expedition's most important questions, whether or not there was a Northwest Passage, or more properly, a commercial waterway passage across the continent, and the answer was a resounding no. So where Cook first found out from sea, Lewis and Clark found out by land that it was a figment. In one sense, then, the expedition had really served its purpose in some respects because it had laid to rest that Northwest Passage idea. It was a centuries-old idea, a geographical myth, really, which is a story about how the world should be shaped. And from that point on, our ideas about it were changed forever. As they proceeded on toward the westward setting sun, Lewis and Clark entered a new environment. Their experiences in this region occupies the greater part of 3 volumes in Gary Moulton's new edition of the journals. From nearly their first day west of the Continental Divide, the captains described the environment in ways distinct from their descriptions of the Missouri. There were so many differences, large and small, from vegetation to Native American cultures, that one of the rifts that continues through the journals is a difference, not often heavily stated or sharply stated, but there nonetheless. The Columbia River Basin itself, we have to at least get in our minds. Gee, if I could just operate one of those machines, I'd have, but I can't do that. It's a huge funnel fan-shaped region that includes deep glacial gouge lakes, the deepest gorge in North America, a vast volcanic plateau, and a massive volume of water that is second only to the Mississippi on the continent. It's the only break in the cordillera that surrounds the Pacific Ocean at water level or at sea level. It's a unique river, and its basin is unique. Unlike the Missouri River, the Columbia River waters fall to the sea in cataract after cataract through gorges. And unlike the Missouri, the Columbia's several environments butt up to each other in sharp contrast, from wet alpine zones of permanent ice to upland forests of mixed conifers and deciduous trees, to semi-arid and treeless plateaus interlaced by rock gorges, to a coastline among the wettest in North America. Understanding the Columbia as a new country is going to be my focus today with respect to the Lewis and Clark expedition. And by new country, what I mean is that it was an undescribed country. It was an imaginary cartography that John Allen has so brilliantly described in Passage Through the Garden, and I recommend that book. It's a geography that, as he pointed out, was imagined to begin in a pyramidal height of land, that is, the river system, something that Bob Carricker mentioned this morning. But beyond the Missouri drainage, except for 110 miles of the Columbia's bottom course, it was terra incognita in many respects, and the lines drawn on the maps that were in Lewis and Clark's possession and studied by Jefferson did not really give any kind of an idea of what was out there, save that terra incognita, and expected, interestingly enough, by both Lewis and Clark to be similar to what was on the east side of the Rockies, part of an imaginary geography. The watercourses and interconnections between the Missouri and the Columbia had been creative imaginatively, but logically, and they'd been etched into maps. The maps that were used were fresh maps, David Thompson's maps, which accompanied the publication of Mackenzie's journals, Vancouver's maps that were published in 1798, which was part of William Broughton's survey of the Lower Columbia. So what Lewis and Clark had with them was the best knowledge. As Bob said this morning, they were Enlightenment scholars, and they had the very best. But as Allen has pointed out, Lewis and Clark never really got a grasp on the Columbia, not really. Even at the very end, after they'd gone to Clatsop, stayed there and returned, they still never really understood what the Snake River was about, how long it was. They didn't understand what the Willamette River was about. They had the Willamette too long and the Snake too short, and they had it going through the wrong zones. But what happened to Lewis and Clark and all of this on the Columbia is really a multifaceted story of discovery. It is more than a story of 2 men leading an expedition and trying to fill in the blank spaces on our map of Western America. And it is more than the story of the expeditions encountering new peoples and describing new landforms, plants, and animals. In looking at the Columbia, Lewis and Clark were describing a place in a new land. They recorded their observations in the copious journals and gave dimension to their experiences on the new river. In the process, they added to and altered what I would call an invented place, which included the imaginary geographies they carried with them, their mental maps that came from their own experiences east of the Appalachians, and the myths of discovery that fueled their expedition. What I want to focus on here is how those Enlightenment era explorers chartered their way through the Columbia and what it did to them. We should begin by asking what discovery means, and then how discoveries are recorded in journals, and finally interrogate the captains about how they saw it all. And that's where I think we ought to begin. And that's where I'll stop reading. The Columbia is so different from the Missouri and so different from the experience that Lewis and Clark had that when they wrote in their journals, they had, I think, an intellectual problem. Either they were going to continue to write in their journals in the same fashion that they had begun at the very beginning of the journey, or they were going to alter how they wrote in the journals by virtue of what they encountered. They chose to write as they had been writing. They chose to continue the same pattern of description, a keen observation. But an observation I want to suggest later in this talk that is typical of scientific observation and Enlightenment thinking, but doesn't tell us very much. But before I do that, they were writing in their journals about discovery. And the question I want to pose is, what is discovery, first? And secondly, how do we note it down? And thirdly, what does it mean to us? Because if we're talking about discovering something, we're talking about what Bruce Greenfield calls a myth of discovery. It is an expectation, a drawing up of plans before one has gotten to the place. It is a describing of what is expected to be seen. And it is doing that within the plot or a narrative of a discovery episode or pursuit. In other words, it has a story. In the case of Lewis and Clark, that story begins with the instructions given to them, specifically to Lewis, by President Jefferson. We've had some discussion about that already, and certainly Bob Carricker's ticking off of the instructions with respect to observations of Native American tribes is daunting. And you kind of wonder how Lewis and Clark, Lewis himself, Clark as his aide together, how they could have possibly gone out on this journey of discovery without already knowing what they were going to discover. It's true. That's an accurate description. It is a myth of discovery. Did they notice everything that they saw? No, they couldn't have. Did they write down all that they saw that is directly connected to one of those numerous points, reference points, objectives we might call them, in that letter of instruction? And the answer is no, they didn't. But did they write down as much as they possibly could? In fact, such an amount of what they saw and about what they did, so many words, with so much detail, that you wonder if they enjoyed even 1 minute of it. I can't imagine taking my own trip of discovery and writing that much. To me, that makes them all the more remarkable, but it's a question. Let's put that off on the side, sort of in marginalia, and we'll come back to that question because that is an important question. So they wrote, but they wrote on the basis of a script. They were not sent out with this simple charge. And if Jefferson had done this, think of what difference it would have made with the journals. What if Jefferson had said, go, look, write, come back, talk? What if that's all he did? What kind of journals would we have had? Well, they wouldn't be what we've got. And many people would say they'd be lousy, or they would be insufficient, or we wouldn't be talking about them in 1992. I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. Again, put that in the margin side because we're coming back to that point. So they have a myth of discovery, and that myth of discovery is extremely powerful. And it has two components to it. The first component is the instructions. And we know what those are, and we know about what they're going to do because we've been talking about that. But there's a second component that is equally important, and John Allen talks about this in his book, and I, again, highly recommend it to you. And that is that there is a baggage, if you want to use that, that's almost kind of pejorative. There is an accumulation of ideas and thoughts and understandings, some of them very, very new, some of them so exciting that people going out from the culture of the United States at that young time of our republic would have been so excited about, such things as republicanism, small r, and those sorts of things, that it would have been a very exciting thing, no question about it, but there were so many other things that they took with them that are part of their intellectual heritage and in place, part of their intellectual projection. I seriously question whether Lewis and Clark could possibly have seen the Native American cultures in anything that anyone would call objective light. And I'm not suggesting that anybody's objective anyway, but I think we have to face that immediately. In fact, I would make the statement, and if Jim Ronda were here, we could maybe get into an argument about it, that Lewis and Clark really had very little idea of what was going on with Native Americans, and Jim does say that in his book, but I think he gives Lewis and Clark too much credit, frankly. I don't think they saw very much of what was taking place, and I've got some examples of that. So we've got two problems, in a sense, for them. In one sense, it allows them to have a plan, and therefore they know whether they're on task. And they stay on task, and it's amazing. And don't forget, they both have military backgrounds. But on the other hand, it's limiting. And so the myth of discovery has a tendency to tell us what we're going to get at the end, even though we haven't even started to do it. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, on his epic voyage, wrote in his log, passed through extremely hot weather, wine casks burst, men thirsty, horrible conditions, and he didn't write, we proceeded on, wish he had, but on Christopher Columbus went to make that incredibly important, world-changing, revolutionary discovery. Why did he have this little section about going through this hot place? And in fact, did he go through a hot place? Well, no one knows whether he went through a hot place or not. We only have his word for it. But the major reason he put it in there is because in the minds of 14th and 15th century imaginations of the world, there was a torrid zone through which human beings could not sail and survive. That's why. So we'll sail through it and we will survive, and we have accomplished something, and we have triumphed, and we have not only done something new, but we have confirmed the existence of the world as we imagined it, which is this horrid, torrid zone, which, by the way, in a footnote you might note, is one of the basic underlying intellectual foundations for African American slavery. Because anything below that torrid zone was not human. Now, I mention that because it's a graphic example from one of the icons of Western civilization and his experience. Lewis and Clark had many that were similar to that, not quite as graphic, but similar. And one of those imaginary, or one might say myths, that they carry with them is the kind of individuals, human beings, that they were going to meet and how they should conduct business with them. And we know from Jim Ronda's book and from what Bob said this morning that that was fractured when they got onto the Columbia. And so that's something we need to look at as well. But before we can do that, I think we have to ask some other questions. And one of them is this: what are the journals? Gary, I don't know whether Gary will address this tonight or not. But it's a question I've had for a long time. I don't really know what the journals are. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. If you take the journal's course and distance notations, which are scattered throughout in the current new edition, and wonderfully so that we can put them into context and understand what they are. That's one kind of journal. If we look at Lewis's and Clark's daily entries and the copying that was done over those daily entries and the field notes, that's another kind of journal. And then if we take the miscellanies at Fort Mandan and at Clatsop, that's a third kind of journal. And what I'd like to know is, which one is the real journal? Are they all the real journal? The way Gary approaches it in the new edition is to say it's all the real journal. It's the whole thing. It's the corpus. And of course, that's exactly what we need. So he's right in doing that. But there is a question, which is the real journal, or which is the journal you want to, which is the journal you're going to take your information from? And you might say, well, what difference does it make? I mean, after all, they're jotting it down, then they're in camp maybe a day later, and they start to write it out. And we know many times when this happened, when they would write it out maybe a day or two later, and some things would be perhaps altered a little bit or put into a different context or something like that. You know. And you say, well, you know, it doesn't make any difference. And we know that the notations of the astronomical sightings and distances and that sort of thing, that doesn't really make that much difference. I mean, it's part of the whole thing. But they're different. They're quite different. Now, let me give you an example. You go to Los Angeles. I don't know why, but you go to Los Angeles. And you may be there during one of the great events, Super Bowl or something like that. And you write a card home, or you keep a daily journal and you take a few jotted down notes, or you're an accountant and you keep your receipts, you're on an expense account or something. Then you write a letter, and then when you get home you write another letter. All three of these are different. Each one of them is a journal or record of your trip. But the ones that were done on the spot and the ones that were done in shorthand may have a completely different character to them, a completely different punch to them, and more importantly, may be connected to you in a completely different way than the ones that were done later. And when we see the difference between the miscellanies done at Mandan and Clatsop with the daily journal entries, we should ask ourselves not just that they're different, and not just that they have a different purpose, but, and this is something I want to come back to in more detail, they are expressed by a different human emotion. It comes from a different place inside the body and the mind. So it's different. Now, I don't know which one of these journals is the one I want to really focus on when I'm talking about Lewis and Clark, and maybe I should focus on all of it. But what if some of those are so different in some respects about certain incidents or about certain descriptions that they suggest either people in conflict with themselves inside, or something that happened quite different that they don't want to think about, or we can make our own list of things that happened that could be so different. So, what I'm suggesting here is that while we look and read the journals, and if you don't read the journals, as Bob said this morning, if you don't read the journals, you ain't getting it. You got to get to them. That's critical. And when you read them, there's something going on in there perhaps that we ought to ask questions about. So, which are the real journals? I don't know. One other thing. Lewis and Clark worked in tandem. We know that. It's extremely difficult to determine just what that tandem relationship is. You can talk to people who have attempted biographies of both men or have written biographical pieces on them, have written about the exploration in various ways that deal with this subject, and everybody has a slightly different idea, and you probably have a different idea too, and it probably comes through the journals in a way. How many of you, when you read the journals, actually begin to say to yourself, I really don't like this guy? Anyone? Does anyone dislike Lewis or Clark when they're reading them? Or you don't like what they're saying? It makes you mad? Anyone? No one? I can't believe that. There are a lot of times when I get really upset when I read it, because they're saying some things that I think are just, I don't understand it. And I say, what is this? Why are they acting this way? Or why are they saying this? What I'm pointing out here is that we don't know how they work together. We do know that they talk to each other, obviously. We do know that they were copying, especially Clark. And we do know that they took each other's information in the context of forming their own opinions about various things. And many of those are noted. Many of them are noted by either their direct entries or by referring to each other in the context of the entries. And therefore you know, okay, this decision was made in part at least because Clark brought this information, or Lewis thought about it this way, or something else happened over here. Okay, that we know. But what we really don't know in the context of that, and what we haven't been able to penetrate, but we need to look at and try and penetrate, I think, is how did the two men relate to each other emotionally? How did they relate? Not in the intellectual derivative sense of the recording of the specific acts and words, etc., but how did they relate to each other emotionally and what was happening to them? It's not explicit in the journals. It is rare, really, when Lewis or Clark say, in some self-revealing way, I feel X. Somebody who's really gone through the journals carefully might be able to point out several of these that I've missed, but I can't remember too many in which, for example, Lewis said, I really feel sad. I really do. Or Clark says, I'm just elated. I can't stand it, I'm elated. Or that is just unbelievable or spectacular or something. Now there are many hyperboles in the journals that crop up. But the interesting thing to me is that the lack of strong statements of that sort. And I would take it back to that list. And I would take it back to the myth of discovery and the plot, the narrative of what is supposed to take place, in part. And the fact that these men are doing a job. All you have to do, if you're interested in this kind of thing, is to pick up David Douglas's journals on the Columbia in the 1830s. Now, they're different men, of course, but David Douglas was just out there doing a sort of a job. It wasn't like this. Now, what about the Columbia itself? What happens to them, and what can we say about how they describe the Columbia? And I'll come back to some of these other questions that I've outlined. The Columbia is different. It is different in a way that was surprising to them. First, it's different because they didn't expect to have a completely different physiographic beast on their hands that they found. They thought that it was going to be similar to the east side. That's the first thing. The second thing is they were in a bad situation, as we know. They spent a lot of time messing around, going up to the headwaters and beyond, if you want to take Three Forks' headwaters, which is certainly a good determination, up to the upper reaches of the sources of the Missouri. And they were in a bit of a bind, we know that. And we know that one of the critical places in the journals is when Lewis is trying to make those connections with Shoshones. And if you want to read what I think is one of the most exciting sections in the journals, read that section, it's incredible. Especially the manipulative devices that Lewis uses. It's really quite brilliant. But once they get to the top and once they cross the divide and they're into a new country altogether. The sides of these mountains, Lewis writes on August 23, 1805, meaning the Salmon River, present generally on barren surface of confused and broken masses of stone. The sides of the mountain are very steep, and the torrents of water which roll down their sides at certain seasons appear to carry with them vast quantities of loose stone into the river. That after the river reached this mountain, it continued its route to the north for many miles high in perpendicular rocks, rolling, foaming, and beating against innumerable rocks which crowded its channel. Captain C being perfectly satisfied as to the impracticability of this route either by land or water. This is the beginning of a series of descriptions of the rivers in the Columbia River Basin that can be emphasized by underscoring one word: rapid. I don't want to emphasize too much one word, but rapid. In the section on the Snake River, a section of, I don't know, maybe, I think I've got a note here as to how many miles. 154 miles. There is a notation in the journals, in the course and distance section, of 29 rapids that were considered to be dangerous, very dangerous, rugged, or severe. The same thing will happen from the Umatilla to Celilo. It's not until they get through the Cascades near present-day Beacon Rock, and you saw the slide this morning that shows you the difference in the river, that they broke free of this. Now, it begins early as a description of water that's different. Near the Dalles, October 25th, 1805. This is Clark. The pinnacle of the Round Top Mountain, which we saw a short distance below the forks of this river, is south 43 degrees west of us and about 37 miles. It is at this time topped with snow. We call this the Falls Mountain, or Tim Mountain, which is Mount Hood. The face of the country on both sides of the river above and about the falls is steep, rugged, and rock is open and contained but a small portion of herbage, no timber, a few bushes excepted. Natives at the upper falls raft their timber down the Twarnox River, or the Deschutes, and those at the Narrows take theirs up the river to the lower part of the Narrows from this creek and carry it overland 3 miles to their houses. Downriver, 5 days later. The bottom above the river is about 1/4 of a mile wide and rich. Some deer and bear sign. Rained moderately all day. We are wet and cold. Several small species of wood, which I never saw before, some resembling beech and other poplar. Day dark and disagreeable. Day dark and disagreeable. It's the first mention of the dread. It's the first notation of that which will dominate the rest of their time on the Columbia. This on October 30th, 1805. The dark, dreary, damp weather, despite Portland Chamber of Commerce and Astoria asides and slick brochures, that dark dread hangs over them throughout the rest of this journey. At the mouth of the Sandy River, so-called Quicksand River by them, Lewis and Clark trundle up the river a ways, take a look at it, and then describe it this way. This is Clark writing, November 3rd, 1805. We find it to be a very considerable stream discharging its waters through 2 channels, which forms an island of about 3 miles in length on the river and about 1.5 miles wide, composed of coarse sand, which is thrown out of this quicksand river, compressing the waters of the Columbia and throwing the whole current of its waters against its northern banks. This is a powerful image of water. There are powerful images of water at Celilo, the Dalles, and the Cascades as well. And here down on this placid part of the river, as we would call it, another powerful image. So it's a dark and it's a wet place. It's a place of rapid waters, and it's a place with power based on the water. November 6, 1805. Now they're into the really dark areas. Encamped under the hill on stones, scarcely land sufficient between the hills and river, clear of the tide, for us to lie. Cloudy and rain, all wet and disagreeable. Underscore disagreeable. They're slammed up against the north bank of the Columbia River. Next day, November 7. 1 mile on the starboard side, high hill, a thick fog. Can't see across the river opposite the lower point of an island, today's Puget Island. November 14th, farther down the river. We could not move. One canoe was broken last night against the rocks, but the waves dashing her against them in high tide. About 10 o'clock, 5 Indians came up in a canoe through immense waves and swells. They landed and informed us they saw the 3 men we sent down yesterday. Next day, November 15th. The rainy weather continued without a longer intermission than 2 hours at a time. From the 5th in the morning until the 16th is 11 days rain, and a most disagreeable time I have experienced, confined on the tempest coast, wet, where I can neither get out to hunt, return to a situation, or proceed on. They were trapped. Now I'm going to suggest that there's a combination of things happening. First, they're in a portion of the river that they have no experience previously in their own experience, and no mental map that gives them enough detail to expect this, even from Broughton's survey. Second, the river itself and the climate which is connected to it, and they don't separate the two very much, is strong enough and powerful enough to dominate them. And third, they have been traveling in a territory in which their relationships with Native Americans have been increasingly disagreeable, as we found out this morning. Now, if you took a trip to Los Angeles and these things happened to you, I would venture, number one, you wouldn't go back. Number two, you would have a bad time. It would be negative. And I am suggesting that we give Lewis and Clark some opportunity to have a bad time. And they do. They have a bad time. November 24th, 1805. They're on the north side of the river. They have already made some forays to determine where they might be able to camp. They have determined that it is not a good place to camp, and they are considering relocating, and some suggestions have been made that they head back up the river once they see the ocean, basically. Put your toe in it, get out. Let's go upriver where we can perhaps have a better wintering. Well, these discussions have been described and analyzed by both Jim Ronda and John Allen and others, and they're fascinating, really, when you think about the decision-making that was going on. And it makes these men really appear to be exceptional, that they're able to make the kinds of decisions they do, because as we know, overall, this is a very successful adventure, very successful bit of geographical surveying. Where the Indians come up and they say, hey, we saw 3 of your guys. Well, what had happened is they had sent Coulter and 2 others out to scout. And this is when they're down at the estuary, essentially, trying to find some better places. And also trying to find some indications of whites, because they had been hearing about whites from the earliest, really, discussions of what the nature of the river was, the Columbia. Coulter and 3 of the men returned and informed us that he had proceeded with his canoe as far as they could for the waves and could find no white people or bay. He saw a good canoe harbor and 2 camps of Indians. This theme of the whites who were trading at the mouth and the potential for them to have a habitation there first, or more likely, as Clark puts it, to come periodically to trade, is extremely important to Lewis and Clark, and it's not something new. It's something that they knew from the very beginning. After all, President Jefferson gave them that letter of credit. But it crops up more and more and more, the more disagreeable, the darker, the wetter, the more dismal they see things, and the more trapped they get. They begin to invent a place that doesn't exist, in essence. They invent it first in the descriptions of the geography, and then they invent it in the geography attached to the story. October 25th, 1805. We're back up the river now. And Clark is getting his canoes down through one of the rapids, an extremely narrow channel. I conceived to be the worst part of this channel, a narrow slot, and felt myself extremely gratified and pleased that he had made it through. We loaded the canoes and set out, and had not filled the crossing, that bad place, before run against a rock and was in danger of being lost. This channel is through a hard, rough black rock from 50 to 100 yards wide, swelling and boiling in a most tremendous manner, several places on which the Indians inform me they take salmon as fast as they wish. We pass through a deep basin to the starboard side, 1 mile below which the river narrows and divided by a rock. The story here is one of accomplishment, one of triumph over the river. And I would suggest that in reading those descriptions of the river, especially across that section that was dry and arid above this point, one of the things that Lewis and Clark is really expressing in large measure is a power that they can exert of their own will in dealing with the river. There were several places in this section where they could have done something other than shoot these rapids. There is mention in the journals that Indians told them, in essence, you're nuts. And they mention quite prominently that the Indians will watch them to see what they're doing to find out whether or not they'll make it. Now, I suggest that it's very possible that Lewis and Clark was doing something they could do in no other way with those Indians, and they already had disagreements with them, and that was watch. Watch us. So they not only overcome environment in a very direct way, which is something that we know the Enlightenment era really wants. In its deepest hopes, its profoundest expectations, it wants control over environment. First through catalogs, then through manipulation, and finally transformation if possible, which we achieve in the 20th century. Now, those two things, power against the environment and also telling the Indians, look, this is what I have done, are important in the context of their understanding of their own experience in and their writing about the Columbia River. I think I'm running a bit long, and I'm going to deal with 2 more things, and then we can open it up for questions. There's one other thing that I think we have to look at that I mentioned early on and put off on the side. And it's connected to this. Lewis and Clark, when they came down the Columbia, had some difficulties in understanding what they were going to do, first with the geography. How were they really going to put it on the map, because it was very confusing to them? And secondly, how could this area, especially the area of the Snake River, which is treeless, dry, and as Bob pointed out, the Indians had adapted to that rather successfully by collecting food sources that didn't need fire. They didn't really know what to do with this new place. Their descriptions of it are not very good. They're not very specific. Once we get to the trees, then we get some nice descriptions, or better descriptions. That's their experience from east of the Mississippi, of course. But they don't really know what they're doing. At one point, they go up the river to the Yakima. And there, Clark takes a quick survey of the Yakima. October 17th, 1805. The squaws engaged preparing them, salmon, for the scaffold. A squaw gave me a dried salmon. This river, meaning the Yakima, is remarkably clear and crowded with salmon in many places. I observe in ascending great numbers of salmon, underscored, dead on the shores, floating on the water and in the bottoms, which can be seen at the depth of 20 feet. The cause of the immense numbers of dead salmon I can't account for. October 18th, the next day. The fish being very bad, those which was offered to us, we had every reason to believe was taken up on the shore dead. We thought proper not to purchase any. We purchased 40 dogs, for which we gave articles of little value, such as beads, bell, thimbles, of which they appeared very fond. You're a Yakima, and you're there. What do you think these people are doing? They're going to turn away from dead salmon, and they want dogs. It's not part of the understanding of what this river is, because in essence, the river itself has elements to it that are new, and for Lewis and Clark, they describe it, but they don't pursue it. On coming down the Columbia, they went past a very bad rapids. And in the Journal of Course and Distance, this is what was written. Lodge of Indians scattered all along starboard side, drying fish and prickly pear to burn in winter. I went on shore in a small canoe ahead, landed at the first 5 lodges, found the Indians much frightened, all got down into their lodges, and when I went in, found some hanging down their heads, some crying, others in great agitation. I took all by the hand and distributed a few small articles, which I chanced to have in my pockets, smoked with them, which expelled their fears. In the entry in the journal, it's much longer than that, the description, because that's the quick one. Much longer than that, excuse me. And he goes through and explains what he did and what others did. Cruzat played the violin. There were lots of activities to try and alleviate the terror that these Indians felt. Years later, the description, which is in Biddle's notes, in conversation with Clark, went something like this. Clark said, you know, that incident, later on, the Nez Perce Indian with us told us that because I had shot a crane and a duck out of the sky and had then come onto the shore of the river, and they hadn't understood how I did this, they thought that I came from the clouds. And when it's written up in the daily entry, I want you to listen to this carefully. I then set myself, as Clark, on a rock and made signs to the men to come and smoke with me. Not one come out until the canoes arrived with the 2 chiefs. And then I excerpted some stuff out, or ellipsed some stuff, and they get to the critical point. They said, we came from the clouds, etc., etc., and we're not men, etc., etc. This time, Captain Lewis came down with the canoes. Etc., etc. What does this mean? I think there are 2 explanations for this possible. One of them is, I don't understand, whatever it is, although you usually don't write etc., etc. for something you don't understand. You usually write etc., for something that you have heard before and you know well and isn't very important. What Clark is saying here is the description of him falling out of the clouds is superstition, and the response by the Indians about it isn't worth recording. It's not important. It's beyond the experience, and it doesn't mean a damn thing. It's not important. Now let me skip back up one more thing on this point. I left off something. I left it off because Clark left it off. But I want you to think about this as well. From that same earlier description I read, which is the course and distance description, I'll reread the last portion of that I read before and then include the portion I didn't include. Some crying and others in great agitation, I took all by the hand and distributed a few small articles which I chanced to have in my pockets and smoked with them, which expelled their fears. I am confident that I could have tomahawked every Indian there. Which journal do you want to read? Do you want to read the Lewis and Clark journal that says, well, they said that we came out of the clouds, etc., etc., etc.? Or do you want to read the Lewis and Clark journal excerpt that says, I could have tomahawked every single one of them right there? What in the world is that doing in there? Where did it come from? Why would anyone write that I could tomahawk women and children and men huddled, crying, and wringing their hands inside of their domicile, with no weapons brandished toward me? Why? That's incredible to me. But I think there is maybe a partial explanation here. Maybe. Now I'm going to speculate. I haven't been speculating yet, right? I'm going to suggest something else. I think that it's very possible that Lewis and Clark, as they came down the Columbia, in an area that was really quite unbelievably different in so many respects than what they had expected and what they had experienced in the Missouri, had lost total control of the environment. Total control. They were going to lose even more control when they got into that wet weather. But up until that point, while they had had difficulties with the environment, and you could put in there the mosquitoes of Great Falls if you want, or the white bear, for the most part, they had a pretty good idea of what that environment was, not only from Indian description, but also from their expectation, which turned out to be pretty close to accurate, about the nature of the drainage of the Missouri River. But when they got into that folded, convoluted, cut, gouged, gorged, tumbling, rapid, rugged, dry, what a surprise, Columbia River, they lost control of the environment. And to some extent, this kind of outburst by Clark might be explained by virtue of his expression, as bizarre as it is, and it reminds me of Yellow Wolf's description of what happened when one of the Nez Perce killed one of the Yellowstone tourists in 1877 in Yellowstone Park. Yellow Wolf said that the Indian stood at the front of the door, shot the man in cold blood, and said, "I am a man." This could be Clark saying, "I am a man, and a powerful man, and an Enlightenment man. And by God, they've lost control to some extent." This suggests a second thing that I will leave you with, and we can have some questions that I won't speculate too much more on, and that's this. Morris Berman has written a book called Coming to Our Senses. I highly recommend this book to you. And in this book, he says our history is potentially all wrong because Western civilization, the same thing that produced the Enlightenment, separated man from body, a mind from body, so completely that we have lost the ability as historians to actually record what happens in history. Because what happens in history is interior in the body, it's somatic, as well as it's intellectual and cerebral. Lewis and Clark's experiences, I would offer, when we read them and think about them, ought to be connected very definitely, and we can only do it through our imaginations, because they didn't write about it very much, to what was happening to their bodies. Thank you.